Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. I think we've got 28 people here in the lecture today, which is a fairly small number, but that was kind of always expected because we're going to have people finishing their assignment 1. So how's everyone? Send me a message in the chat. Tell me how life is. Tell me if you're good or not. I'm just trying to get this stupid webcam working. Don't know why it's not working. Tia says working on task 4. Devon says life's good. They're all great things to hear. Okay. Perfect. Wonderful, good, life. Everyone seems so happy. You guys are the easiest cohort I've ever had to teach. You barely have any questions in the forum. Most of your questions are easy. Your tutors tell me you're wonderful. It's like all of it. All of it's excellent. So congrats. And I hope assignment 1's been okay to survive as well. I know for some of you it being due on a Friday has probably been a little bit difficult, though I do hope it's one less thing you have to worry about on the weekend. And of course the late penalties are pretty serious, so realistically what ends up happening is that a number of you will submit it. Well, I mean, many of you watching this lecture are probably on top of it, but a number of you will submit it tomorrow night around like midnight or something, because normally we find a lot of students, they'll kind of, they'll be relatively on top of it, but it kind of comes to 8 and they want to do some touches and they realize they might not going to get like 94% anyway, so they take the extra time. But whether you submit it on time or ready later, it's all up to you. We support you all the same. So the first week's lecture we did a big conceptual piece on web technologies, and then as part of the second week's lecture we did a big conceptual piece on like kind of JavaScript technology, if you will. And what our focus is going to be on today is actually something more practical, which is actually getting in and using JavaScript. So as you know, there was kind of these lectures in week 2 that were all about, what is JavaScript and what's the DOM and how do web pages load. And then this week, which again you've hopefully watched, I'm aware some of you might not have watched it. If you're watching the recording of this later, stop this and go watch those lectures first. Are all about event-driven programming with JavaScript forms and HTML forms. That kind of, well, it's more HTML forms that JavaScript uses a lot, and local storage. And the point of today's lecture is to tie pretty much all of those concepts together, with the exception of local storage, which I don't think we have anything explicitly planned for it. Most of what we do up until this point allows you to build pages and make them dynamic with JavaScript. A lot of what happens in week 4 onward is a little bit more in terms of how do we do some interesting functional network input-output stuff, getting into the harder part of JavaScript. But for now, yeah, it's pretty much just building pages, and that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. So today we would like to build a simple form for a communication tool that says, please invite your friends to join CSE, and then it has a text area with a welcome message, and then it has 2 inputs for email addresses, and add more button that'll add more addresses. So the plan is to build this out with vanilla JavaScript, which is the JavaScript you've been working with, like task 4 style JavaScript. And then if we have time, which I have no idea if we will, because that'll depend on how many questions you have, we will try and then do a similar thing but in React.js and start to compare and contrast. And if we can't do those things today, we'll do them another week, maybe week 5, I'm not sure. And before we start, Quinjan, if I've said your name correctly, I hope so, sorry if I haven't. What's the difference between an input type inside a form and an input type outside a form? That is an excellent question. And let's have a chat about that too. So I've got this really simple page here. It's inside of lectures week 3, 21T1. I'll upload it after the lecture. On the odd chance I forget, I'm sure someone can give me a bump. And we're going to open that file as well. So let me just open that file up. Give me 2 seconds. We'll open it up in the web browser. Oopsie. Yep, so here's our page. It's empty. Nothing here. Nothing here but hopes and dreams and potential. So we have our basic page. We've been through this a ton of times. Our heads, our bodies, and everything else. I will rehash some topics we've already explored, just so you know, people, I guess, can keep having these concepts reiterated in. Inside my head, I'm going to give it a title, which can just be Join CSE or something like that. This will obviously update the page's title up here. That says Join CSE now. That's great. I could possibly also give it a fav icon if I wanted to. Let's try this out. I wonder if there's like CSE sock. I assume CSE sock's a thing at UNSW. Oh, so they have this cute little thing up here. See this little funny less than e and e or equal to. And we can find it on the page by looking for the fav icon, and it's right here. Fav icon. Says the actual icon. Let's see if we can steal that. Let's try this out. I mean, we could just copy the whole line. It's probably the easiest thing. But we will actually have to give it the full URL, right? So link rels that are shortcut icon, they have this type. I think you can get away without some of those things. But because it's not our domain, we will need to give it the full URL, which in like the absolute URL. Let's try this out. See if this works. Let's see if this is a bad idea. Yay! Stolen. We don't even pay for that bandwidth now. Isn't that great? So all those images that are being loaded, every time I load this page, we're just sucking out of our CSE Socks website. There you go. Fav icon tells you where it's from in the network tab here. There's going to be a lot more about the network tab in week 4. Yeah, you can see media CSE sock. There it is. We can look at lots of information on it. That's the IP address of the server. Not much will probably happen if you go there, but you never know. Yep, it's kind of like, I'm just showing you random stuff while we're here. It's like, sorry, but you made a request that is non-HTTPS. I don't think we talk about HTTPS in this course, but that just makes things secure, and not much else is really interesting here. It tells you what the server is. This is all stuff your browser gets. Like when your browser gets, like, says to a server, hey, I want some information. The server sends back information with a whole bunch of other stuff. So this is often fun to comb through and make sense of. If you're bored, which you're often not. So let's keep going. Okay, so we've got our page, we have our head, we got our nice little fav icon, and then we're going to go back to the question which said, oopsie. Let's build a page that says, please invite your friends to join CSE. So when you're building pages, one of the best things to do is to just essentially prototype it as quickly as possible. Let's get all the key contents down. Please invite your friends to join CSE. Don't need the exclamation mark. Has a text area with a welcome message. I'm assuming that means the welcome message is in the text area. So, you know, let's try this here. It says the color background's red. We'll come back to that. And then it says it has 2 inputs for email addresses with an add more button at the end that populates more fields. Okay, so I might have 2 inputs. That's the wrong thing. Input type equals text. Nearly got there. 2 inputs and then an add more button. So we'll have a button. So these are all form elements. And that's kind of the crux of the page. Ah, beautiful. Okay, we're basically done. Now, some things you'll notice that are relevant to most pages. The first one is that the default browser font, again, being Times New Roman, is not usually ideal. We often want something a little bit more friendly. So I'm going to include our styles, style type. Is that right? That is right, isn't it? I don't write enough. I'm going to assume that's correct. Style type equals text CSS. I think I'm just being over worried about nothing, because I'm sure it's the same on... Yep. Okay, so back to my page. Lost it already. Oh god, this is what happens now. I share the the favorite icon with CSE socks on my page. It's hard to find. Okay, I've got this page now. First thing I want to do is I'm going to make the font not Arial. Sorry, not Times New Roman. I'll just make it Arial. Make the page just a little bit more friendly. That's an easy thing. Now you can also see that the one thing we're missing from the spec here is that the on blur, if the field is empty, the color background is red. Okay, so it doesn't want the color background red all the time. It just wants it red when a certain condition is met. Now when it comes to your assignment 2 and your assignment 3, we're often going to ask you to do things like your app or your page has to do this, and you will do that. But you can also feel free to embellish and improve the quality of your page. In fact, I believe there's a UI, UX, and accessibility lecture for next week, the first one, to really, I guess, make it nicer. So technically this page kind of contains the elements. It's not pretty, and we don't expect you to make pretty things, but more importantly, it's not actually that usable, which is probably the main problem here, because we do expect you to build usable things. And what I mean by usable is that, this isn't clear what people have to do. So let's try a couple of things here. The first one is, let's give the text area a size. I'm just going to use the tag selector, and I'll say that its width can be 500 pixels, and its height can be 300 pixels. Okay, that looks good. I don't like how this thing's hanging off the side there, so I might just, for now, just put like a little BR there to get it down on the next line. When we look at this, we think, okay, that doesn't look too bad. That's a nice big chunky spot. You think that might be a little bit too big, so let's just wind that down slightly. Okay, that's good. You can tweak things as much as you want. Like when I look at this, my sense of style kind of says it's still a little bit too tall and it's a little bit not wide enough. Okay, that's kind of a reasonable size. I also think the text feels a little bit small for like a welcome message, because you're probably not going to write too much, so maybe we'll increase the font size very slightly. Talk about font sizes in another lecture. I can't remember when. Okay, that's kind of cool. So that's a good start. Ive says, is there a way to kind of make width equal to the width of the H2 text? No, there's no real way to do that. There's probably ways to do it with JavaScript. I think the first problem is the H2 text doesn't actually really have a width because it's a block element, I think. Or it does have a width, but it's not... yeah, it's 461. So you could probably... Oh, does that get wider with the page? Yeah, that's the problem. Like, this element here is as wide as the page. So I don't even think you could read that with JavaScript. So probably not. But most of the time that just comes down to intelligent design and really thinking about things. One thing that sucks about this width though is it's all nice and good for big pages, but what happens when I get small? Now this is like overflown off the page. So sometimes what you might do is you'll say, you know what? I really want to make this 100% of the page. And this will be really helpful because it will adjust it to the page size here, like that. So if the page is bigger, it gets bigger. But I don't really want it to be gigantic on these pages. So you can specify both a width. Oh, that didn't work for me like I was hoping. You can specify both a width and a max width. So if you say that the width is 100%, but then you say the max width is say 500 pixels, it's basically kind of defining a general case and a specific case here. So in this case, it'll stay at 500 pixels max, but if you drag it down, it'll adjust like that. And you might look at that and think, it's still a little bit big. So, what did I choose before? It was like 350. Yeah, 350 is the max size. Okay, so now we've got that. Maybe we want to leave a little message saying like, please add your welcome message. Yeah, that's cute. Sorry, I think a bird just hit something. Okay, we have a little bit now. We think, all right, this is a start. Now we want to make these form elements look a little bit nicer. So if you ever want things to look nice, usually one easy thing to do is to start wrapping them in divs. So I'm going to wrap each of these form elements in a div, and I'm going to call it email input or something. Email input box. Easy. Like that. I'll give this a class name. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can view my screen a little bit bigger and easier. Yep, I give this a class name, email input box, and even just by making that a div, even with no properties, that's going to help sort out the issue. Because as you can see here, every element here is a block element now, because, oh, my stupid fat head's in the way. Put this down here. Yeah. Blocks take up the full width. So you see what actually happens here is that this email input box is the whole width. This is still an inline element, which is why it doesn't take up the whole width, but it's within a block element. So the block element takes up that whole width. Sia asks, what's the difference between width 100% and width 100 VW? So let's get rid of this for a second. And now it's 100%. Let's try VW. Okay. We get something weirder. What's actually happening here? So we can, what is it? VW property CSS. So what VW stands for, tell me if those birds get annoying, by the way. If the birds are like taking up the microphone bandwidth, just let me know. There's a whole bunch of units you can use when it comes to space. Pixels is the most kind of common one. And these are all like absolute positions, right? Like a pixel takes up a certain amount of space on a screen. We then have all these relative ones. VW is 1% of the width of the viewport. Yeah, so the best way I can explain this to people at like a high level is that a percentage, I mean, it says it right here, but like when you do 100%, that's relative to the element that it's contained within, right? And when you do VW, that's relative to basically the whole document. So, I mean, VW works all the time anyway. One of the problems we're having here, so if I had this line, there's been a forum post about this. One of the issues I believe we're having here is that the body always has this 10 pixel margin like baked into it, which it looks like that's what the problem is. Yeah, so you see here that VW, and the difference between VW and 100% here isn't the same because, so think about it like this. The body by default has a 10 pixel margin. So what that means is that on a page, you basically have the body like this, and then inside of that you have everything else. And then there's this, like little 10 pixel margin here. So when you say to an element inside of it, you say, I want you to be 100% width, it goes and looks at the parent it's in. Now in this case, the parent might be the body. The body's a bit, like the text area here is within the body, and because the body has this 10 pixel margin, it will just fit within that 10 pixel margin. But the thing is, the actual viewport width, which is the actual width of the entire viewport, think of that like the window, that's always going to be a certain size. And in this case, the viewport width is 20 pixels wider than the body width, right? Because of the margin. So when I set that text area to be 100 VW, which means 100% of the viewport width, and I had no margin, essentially it tried to fit like an X pixel element inside of a body that's X minus 20 pixels. And that's actually why you can see the very edge of the little corner there. See, it's just over the edge. So in this case, if your body has no margin and you're making an element in the body, the difference between VW and 100% is nothing, because 100% is relative to the parent container, VW is relative to the viewport, or the body, I guess you could say. But if they're both if the parent element is the viewport or the body, then you're going to get the same result. Where these things differ is if you were to make an element, and I'll just use styles here. Say it has a width of 500 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and a background of red. Make some div element like that. If I was to then make another element inside of it that said its width is 10% and its height's 100 pixels and its background's blue, this will be 10% of that actual red element, like that. Whereas if I say 10 VW, which means 10% of the viewport width, it'll be 10% of this whole width here. So it'll be longer. So it'll still scale with the page, of course. Yeah, viewport widths are just really useful. I don't use them a ton, but they're just really useful when you're interested in your element scaling with the page, not the above element. Though they're somewhat interchangeable if you're pretty exacting on all of your measurements. Okay, so I've got my email input box here. Let's give it a margin of, in fact, let's give my text area as well. I mean, actually, let's keep the margin on the page. It was kind of useful. Let's even make it bigger. Perfect. I want this width to be 350 pixels and the max width, sorry, 100% and the max width 350. There you go. Let's give the text area some margin too. So we'll give it 10 pixels at the top and bottom. So that's 10 pixels 0. So top 10, 0, 10, 0. Top right, down, left. And then we'll do the similar thing here for the input boxes. We'll give them 10 pixel and 0 size. Now, one problem you'll notice here is that these kind of don't align as nicely as you might want. So think about this box for a second. If you're ever unsure about elements, one great tip is to just make the background a certain color. So in this case, if I make it red, you can actually see how long it is. And therefore we can start to do some other things, like maybe we'll set its width to 100% and its max width to that. So now this is kind of cool because, you know, that scales in a bit. So at least we know we can occupy that space, but each of these inputs really needs a name or description, right? So you actually need to say email address 1 or something like this, and email address 2. Now you can see this is on the red background right now, and that's all fun. But let's see if we can use Flexbox to maybe drag out the size of those inputs a little bit. So let me get rid of this red background for a sec, or at least let me make it a really light color, like 225, 225, 225. That'll be a really light gray, right? Because it's only 30 red, 30 blue, 30 green away from 255, 255, 255, which is white, right? That's white. And remember, 0 is black. Not 000, just 0. That's it, pretty simple. I also don't like how bunched up this text looks, though I feel like that'll go away once the background's gone, right? Like, oh, that doesn't look too bad now. So how do we get this input to match the width here? That's a great question. We could try and use flex for these things if we want to. Let's try it out. Display flex. Okay, that wasn't terrible. Now inside of here, I'll just start with styles to try something out. So styles, inline styles aren't a terrible way to do prototyping. They're only a terrible way to leave code, because you don't want to leave code as styles because it's just really hard to read, but it's a lot quicker to develop with sometimes. In fact, let's just get rid of the second input, because otherwise we're just going to be like rewriting the same thing again. It's pretty easy to add later. So if I say here flex 1 and I say here flex 2, will this do what I expect it to? Yeah, seems to. I get 1/3 of the element is that and the other 2/3 is that. And if I do 1 and 3, I should get 1/4 and then 3/4. Okay, so yep, the flex seems to work. But what I might do here is I might actually set this one to be flex 1 and set my email address to be a fixed width. And let's just call that width 150 pixels. That's a bit too much. You can see that there, 150 pixels is a bit overkill. But if I try 130, it's kind of okay. Sure. That's good. So what you'll see here is that, and if I maybe make the background of this red, with flex, if you don't specify flex widths, then they space themselves proportionally. If you specify flex widths, like flex numbers, it'll do it proportional to the numbers rather than just like equally. And if you set specific hard widths, like absolute unit widths, you will you'll get that width, and then the rest of the flex elements will occupy what space remains. So here you can see with this background as red, it's occupying all the space that remains. This is the div that wraps the input, by the way, not the input. And as I drag this down, it gets smaller. Now you can see that the input starts to get smaller. Not really, actually, it doesn't. It just gets pushed along. So, you know, that's interesting. Let's try and tweak that a bit. So let's give the input a style of, say, width 100%. Occupy the full space you can with respect to your parent. That's good. Now let's see if this shrinks down. Okay, that's cool. It seems to shrink down. Another thing that you often want to do on web pages, right, just while we're talking about this, is you want to set some minimum widths, because you don't want your page to be completely crushable. You know, a typical minimum width might be 300 pixels. That might seem quite large on your desktop. Like if you think about your phone, you might think, oh my god, my phone is not quite that wide. But the thing is that your phones usually have a higher pixel density than most desktops and laptops you work with. So on your phone, you'd actually see that same image and those same pixels over a slightly smaller space. So 300 is a reasonable minimum size for a phone. So let's stop this shrinking in any further. That's what I don't want. I don't want this to keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So a couple things we could do here, which we haven't even done at the start, is maybe let's wrap this entire thing in a width 100%, max width 350. So we'll actually create a div that wraps everything so that we don't have to keep applying this to all the subsequent elements, right? We can just say that in one spot. See if this works. Okay, so this seems to like work where everything's 100% till it scales down. But now our text input's gone all funny. Why is that? Why is this one so weird? Email input box. Any ideas? I was hoping this would be like, why is this text area in the input box different? You have a quick thing. I'm just gonna turn the aircon on one sec. No max, yeah. So I've just set it, width does not inherit, yeah. So some elements don't inherit width. So even though the width of the container of this text area, right, because this container has a text area, doesn't even have a width. Even though the width of the outer one is 350, the actual text area is an inline element, which means it won't take up the full width. So we actually have to specify here width 100% to say take the full width of your outer element. And it looks like because this one here is display flex, it does it automatically, right? So this email box input that wraps this seems to do that automatically. If I got rid of display flex, there's div elements inside of here, so that makes sense. It's just they're both going to occupy a full line themselves. But now we have something like this. Okay, sweet, that seems to work. And then let's actually specify a minimum width on that too. I mean, my max width of 350 was pretty small, so let's try and put a minimum width. Maybe let's make the max width 450, and the minimum width can be 300 pixels. Cool. Okay, this is nice. That's a reasonably sized form. When I make it smaller, it gets smaller until it won't get any smaller. And then we'll just make some other tweaks, like I kind of want my H2s to be centered, just to make the page feel a little bit more serious. And in fact, let's make all of our headers centered. So I'm going to make my H2 and my H4 header centered. There we go, done. Now the other thing I want to do is when you're on large pages here, it kind of looks a bit, you know, janky to have this tucked over all the way to the left. So I'm going to try and align this entire box here. Now there's lots of ways you can align things and align elements. But what I'm going to do is one way that I main container. I have this terrible habit where I don't follow the style guide of CSS selectors. I think it's because I mainly write a lot of React. So you're kind of meant to use dashes, not camel case. So sorry in advance if I do that again. So we have this, I did this main container class. That's what will give our main div that wraps everything. Except what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it two more properties, which is margin left auto and margin right auto. Now when you give the left and right a margin of auto, basically it tries to make those two margins equal. And to make those two margins equal, it tries to use up all of the space that's not being used in the width, right? So your div is X pixels wide. It sits within a bigger container, so there's a bunch of spare space, and it spreads that margin between those spare spaces, which gives you this kind of centered page. And now this is nice because, you know, it looks good, looks okay full screen, maybe not the most colorful. You can easily F12. Where's my, oh, there we go. You can easily drag it down and it feels kind of mobile friendly-ish. And maybe it's just missing some colors. So let's put a color on the page. CSS, I don't know which CSS standard did this, but CSS Gradients are now part of the CSS standard, which is awesome because you can do some cool things where you say, oh, it's actually a background image. That's really interesting. So you know that with CSS you can set backgrounds, right? Like if I want to give my body a background, I could say that the background will be, you know, some thing like that. And I get pink. Oh, perfect. But if you want to actually have a gradient background, you can do this by specifying a background image. And that background image takes in like, so normally with background image, you might do something like you pass it a URL. Or you're like HTTP something. But another argument you can pass is not URL, right? Because background image, in this case, it's saying, let's give it a URL object. Instead, I can say linear gradient. And in linear gradient, I can give it a direction, which I'm pretty sure is in degrees, and then 2 colors. And let's start with, what are 2 colors? People give me some colors you like. RGBs, hexes, I don't mind. Shoot something through. Just while people share their favorite colors with me, hopefully. Ives has asked, does margin 0 auto do the same thing? Yeah, so margin by itself, remember that like if you do margin 0 auto, it's a way of saying top is 0, bottom 0, left is auto, right is auto. So that's like the shorthand way of writing it. People say pink to blue. All right, well let's just grab a color picker. We have a color picker right here in Microsoft Word. So edit colors. Oh, people are giving me actual colors. That's exciting. Oh, and those two look quite similar. I like that. Tammy and Devansh have given me similar colors. Let's use those. So we got from that color to this color. 4E88E6. Huh. That's super interesting. I wonder what that is. That's a lot of red, a little bit of green, and not much blue. What happens with red and a little bit of green? What do you get? I don't know what you get. If you got red and a bit of green, maybe it gives like an orange? I don't know. We learn things today. Kind of blue. Oh, okay, I like that. Beautiful. Now let's say I look at this and I think, you know what, that's really nice, but it's a little bit harsh. It's just a little bit harsh. So I could grab things like this and I could, it depends, I can't do it here, but a lot of like color pickers online will let you like put in RGB values like this. So I could put that in online and be like, yeah, that gray's kind of nice, though it is just a little bit harsh. So maybe I could like, you know, choose something that's lighter. These are all the different ways to represent colors in color spaces. This is the red, green, blue spectrum. HSV, which is hue, saturation, and can't remember V, hue, saturation, and luminance, I think. Cyan, magenta. You guys know this from printers, right? You've all seen printers with these colors. So lots of different ways to represent colors, but let's maybe grab something like quite light, like that. Just so the page isn't too harsh. That's kind of nice. And this blue's nice, but again, the intensity on it's just a little bit high, so we'll try and find just a slightly more off-white version of that. And then, oh, that looks worse. See, because we've toned down the blue, the gray kind of stands out a lot now, but back here it was a little bit more tame. So let's stick with this. Let's empower our friends. So some other questions. How to use the link of icon after the title tag. I don't understand your question. I'm sorry. Zenji. I says, for some reason that gradient reminds me of beach cave windows background. Beach cave windows background. Oh. Yeah. Man, there's some nice pictures on computer backgrounds. Yeah, V stands for value. I mean, colors are not really a critical part of this course, but they're interesting, you know. Like, there are different ways of doing it. Like with RGB, as you change the red color, like this is as you add more red to something, kind of changes the tone of it. HSV, when you change like the saturation, for instance, that's like the intensity of it. So if I take this from 29 to 100, it gets like really aggressive, and if I go to 0, it's basically white, whereas 29 somewhere in between. So these things are super fun to play with because they're just different ways of understanding it, right? Like HSV pretty much means color, intensity, and V I think is brightness. Yeah, I think V is some form of brightness. So yeah, I'm not an expert on it. Favicon, the little image in the title. Why use a link of that? That's just how it works. Like to get this little icon up here in the little bar, that's how browsers expect that to kind of happen. Great. Okay, we got this little page. It's kind of looking okay. This is it is just a little bit too harsh though. 6. Yeah, I'll stop playing around with it. I'm sorry. Oh, it's so bad. Okay. We have this page. Now we need to add more email addresses here. One thing that isn't great about this which is why I wanted to change the color, is that this is not really appropriate text to color contrast here. Like this text is far too close to the background color in terms of that contrast is not high enough, and in fact it's quite hard to read. So ways around that are you could change the background color. You could also give your actual main container a background like white. That looks kind of weird though. But if we want, we could take that one step further and say, you know, background, let's make it white, but let's make it half transparent, which gives us a really weird effect. So when you do RGB, if you do RGBA, it's actually red, green, blue, and alpha, which is like transparency. So where 1 is fully opaque and 0 is completely transparent. So something like 0.8 will let only a little bit of the blue through. So I could do something like that. I could also give it a margin, just so it has some breathing room. So the actual, oh, I can't do that, right? Messed that up. I meant padding. So what happened there was when I wrote margin 20 pixels, I overwrote. There was an override on that auto margin that I had before. So I say padding, let's give it a lot of generous padding, 30 pixels. That seems kind of nice, though the padding up the top seems a little bit aggressive, so we could change that by changing the top and bottom padding from 30 down to 10. Right, and then you kind of have something like this. And what you notice here is that you're like, oh, but now this looks too narrow. Why does this look too narrow? Well, it's because if you inspect it, what you'll notice is H2 actually has, as part of the standard styling, it actually has 20 pixels of margin kind of baked into it. So therefore, what that means is that you could say, you know what, I actually want to have padding all the way around my element, except the padding top, let's just make that 10 pixels. Then you get something like this. Now you're like, okay, the contrast here is better. So focusing on accessibility, the readability of a page, that's getting there. Let's take our inline styles out. So I had this email input box here. Let's do a child, so email input box. If it has a child class called text, then I want to give it width 130 pixels. And if it has a child element with class name field, then we can give it these styles here. Like that. So then I'll give this class name, which is text and field. And then if I want to, I can say, you know what, if there's an email input box with field that has an input inside of it with a type text, right? So getting really fancy with selectors now, but specificity is really good. It helps make sure that styles don't accidentally inherit into other properties. Okay, so now that's all okay. Quinjian says, why main container would not inherit the background image attribute? Well, only certain properties are inherited, and it's the one that makes sense, like font size or I think color as well. But background image, it wouldn't make sense if the same background image is applied to every single sub element, because things would look really weird. Like, check this out. If this applied to main container, we'd actually get the exact same gradient again, like inside of it, which would just like look super weird, right? Because it's the same background, but just like applied inside of it. By default, elements have no background, which kind of helps backgrounds like implicitly inherit, because everything's just like see-through, so you can see the background behind it. So you have something like this. Now we want to have multiple email addresses. Okay, so let's copy and paste that box twice. Email address 1, email address 2. And then we have an add more button. Okay, so this is about as far as it makes sense to take this stuff without actually, what would you say? Like, this is as far as it makes to take this stuff without getting too crazy about the styling, right? It looks fine. And when it comes to your assessments later, like assignment 2 and 3, we'll ask you to make your pages look nice, but this is what we mean, right? Like, just as a heads up, it's not that we mean we want you to, become like stylistic geniuses and designers. Like, this looks nice. It's simple. It works. I don't like how the add more button feels a little bit cramped though, so I will change that. Sorry. And we'll call this like add more. So button add more. Now, one thing I'm going to do here is when I add the selector, the class selector for the add more button, instead of just saying, font size is going to be 18 pixels and I want it to have a margin at the top of like 10 pixels, that's a bit giant. Instead of saying that, that's actually just too big. Yeah, it's okay. Instead of saying that, I might actually, let's say button dot. So by giving it a tag selector dot the class, this again means that if someone else uses the add more class unintentionally, it's not going to apply those things there. And last thing is I might try and align this to the right. I don't think text align right will work, because this will align the text inside the button. Right? So if the button was larger, that would just move the text inside the button. If I actually want it to be on the right, there's a few different things I can do. Actually, rather than me tell you, how would you align this button to the right? Someone tell me your thoughts. There's a couple different ways we could do it. Yeah, there's always lag, lots of lag. Sometimes on my web stream, some students, there's like so much lag that I'll ask a question and they'll just randomly answer it in the chat like 40 minutes later. Ooh, padding left. Padding left. Okay. So just on the lag front, I'll just wait till the connection comes back. The question specifically was about how are we going to move this button over to the right hand side. While we were chatting, she asked a question, which is, why is the margin between text area and the first text input visibly larger? That's actually a really easy question to answer, because both the text area and the input here, I believe, have some kind of margin. Or maybe that doesn't make any sense. Oh, that's weird, actually. Why is that? Huh. I'm not really sure why those two margins overlap with each other. That's actually strange. I'm not too sure. That doesn't make any sense to me. There you go, mysteries of the universe. Position absolute. I don't think they're position absolute. I don't think that's the problem. Anyway, oh, sorry, that was here in relation to how to move it. So a few things we can do. Someone's mentioned position absolute. Yep, we could say position absolute, and then we could say right 0, which would move it over to the right. But it's moving it over to the right, not exactly how we want it to, because position absolute puts it on the web page, but position relative should do. Oh, but it doesn't. So these positioning things are super weird. Not too much of an issue though. Someone suggested margin left auto. Okay, that doesn't quite work. That's a shame. One of the reasons that's not going to work is because buttons are inline elements, and it can be like, if this makes sense, when you have an inline element, there's no default margins that are applied to either side of it. Whereas when it's a block element, there's a whole bunch of margin that's automatically filled, because basically what happens is that when you have an inline element, when you have a block element, the actual content takes up the width, and then the rest is margined out, margin filled, basically. So I'm pretty sure if we make it a block element, it'll align itself to the right like that. And we'll also give it a slightly higher margin top, like 20 pixels, or maybe 30, something appropriate. Great, perfect, what a great page. Oh no, what's happened now? All of our sizing is off because we have added all this extra padding and margin and stuff here. So that's the last thing we'll try and fix here. As we saw before with our main container, we had a max width of 450. And I'm wondering why we're having this effect here where it's like, sure, okay, this is going to be more complicated to fix. Some of this stuff here we can get around with media queries, which we'll have a look at quickly because we want to get onto the JavaScript stuff after the break. So we'll probably mainly spend the last hour doing JavaScript. We won't talk much about React.js today. All of the suggestions in the chat are really good, like flex, margin left auto, position relative for container, and position absolute for the one more. Yep, that would also work. So if we had this one as position relative, and we had the container as position absolute, that would work as well. Probably overkill, but definitely fine. Also, last two nits are these input sizes seem really small compared to the rest of the stuff, so we'll make those bigger. So I can go to the input here and I could say height 30 pixels. That's going to be pretty big. That's good. And then we'll also need to increase the font size to something bigger too, like 12, say. Like that's much better. We have the problem here where these email addresses are a little bit funny now. I think we solved this through some flex stuff, because remember, these are flex components. So this is a flex container here, and these are flex components. How do we make things... Oh, is the BR there? Oh, that explains it. Sorry, I didn't notice the BR was there, but that doesn't explain it. Mystery. How do we align things with flex? Does everyone remember how to make this? Because right now the problem is this text is kind of floating on the top of the flex box inside the container, and that's making this look really weird. Because you can see we have these inputs here, but these are like floating above it. Align items. Okay, so in the container, if we say align items and then we say center, is it flex or flex center? Justify content center, align item center. This isn't getting us what we want. That's not good. Justify content center. So you can take another, let's debug this quickly together. We go back to our CSS tricks and we say, okay, what's the problem here? So we have a look at our justify content. Now this is going to move things in that direction, the axis that things are defined in. So that's obviously not going to work here because we're going left to right. So it needs to be something on the minor axis, which align items kind of seems okay, right? Because that's what we want. We kind of want, okay, well, we got all these items lined up left to right. We want to align them vertically. Right? So the ways you can get around this are, rather than applying it at the main container level, you do this a couple of different ways, I think. Gaurav suggested align item center in the email input box text. Align item center. Okay, that didn't quite work for us. Text is really funny. Like, I don't know this answer. Most of the time I prime you, I kind of know the answer, but in this case I'm not really sure what the issue is, and I'm sure there's ways to solve it. Usually things like this, I usually try and solve it with some padding, particularly because in this case it's like we're just trying to get the text in the right spot. So sometimes just a little bit of padding. In fact, if we make the font slightly bigger, it's already small. If we make the font slightly bigger, that's possibly too big here. That also just helps how things look. So sometimes just playing around with the padding, like, this is the thing, you don't have to overcomplicate it too. Sometimes just a little bit of padding works fine. The last thing I want to talk about before the break is media queries in CSS. So with CSS, you've probably seen the lecture on it. Oops, media queries max width. So one problem we're having with this page at the moment is that as we scale it down, we run into problems where the max width is like helping us here a little bit, but one of the problems is that the padding on the left is existing all the time, which leads us to this strange scenario here where we can kind of drag the screen over the right padding, but the left padding still exists. So to solve some of these problems, we can use these media screen little conditional things. And what these are, if you remember from the CSS lecture, is they're basically CSS properties that only apply in certain situations. So in this case, this means that what happens is that when the screen size is up to 992 pixels, that the body will have this style. So it's kind of like from 0 to 992. So I could do some funny things, and I'll just demonstrate this for you here. If I say like 300, and then I set the body background to be black, what that means is that as long as the screen width is within 300 pixels, the body background will be black. So as I zoom this in even further, the second I cross that 300 pixel threshold, the background goes to black. In fact, it seems to do it at an even lower threshold. Wonder why that is. It's probably to do with dev tools or something. It's as small as it'll go. Okay. So we can use this to our advantage now by, let me just make this 300? Yeah, okay, that's better. So we can use this to our advantage by saying, you know what, once the screen is below a certain size, and let's just call it, like, what's that width? 550, right? Once it's below 550, I'm going to do some different things with the styling. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the body background to be none, right? Because I don't want to have the body background. And then I'm going to, let's see how that goes. Okay, so once I'm below 550, the body background disappears. Now that kind of sucks because now the page looks like super weird. So maybe we won't do that. Let's try and think of something more reasonable. So if we have the main container class, let's try instead to maybe remove the padding. So let's say padding is 0. So once we go below a certain size, padding's the wrong one. What we meant was, what do we mean? We meant margin, right? Was it margin that we meant? No, I think we meant padding. Oh, sure. It's fine. There's a recording. I see the chat. It's just I can't do anything about it. 7 p.m. is terrible for 1080p uploads on NBN. It happens some weeks. It's always around the same time. I think I'm on like NBN 100 here, so it's just very like random. But like I'm not just going to sit here while we have content to go through. So if it's buffering, you're just gonna have to watch it later, if that makes sense. So if I refresh this, no, it's not to do with the Chrome tabs or the network. Sorry, it's not to do with the Chrome tabs or the computer. It's that NBN uploads are much slower, and at peak time, it's really hard to maintain like an 8 megabit stream, like at this time of day. So what happens now is once I'm under 550 pixels, I'm saying that I want my main container to have no margin anymore and to have a full width. So why isn't that doing that? That's really weird. Am I doing something wrong here? It's already, oh, I see what the problem is. What I meant to say was that we had no padding and we have a no, we don't want to have a max width anymore, I think. Basically what we're trying to do is make this like snap in place. So the width here should be 100%, but it's kind of not, which is a bit confusing for me. Because like once the page gets below a certain size, we want these like strips on the side to kind of disappear and that background just come all the way across it. What I don't understand is once we go down here, the padding seems to drop, but then the width is no longer at 100%, which I don't understand. So let's inspect it together. So we inspect our background here, class main container. Okay, and we can see that its width is 100%, its max width is 0. Its min width is 300. This is really weird. Margin 0 auto. I don't know. Body having a margin of 20 pixels is probably part of the problem here. Kevin says, does media queries work the same without toggling the device toolbar as well? I mean, I don't think it's like, oh, max width is 0. Yeah, thank you. That's very smart. Max width is none. That should have fixed it. Yeah, I think that fixed it. Thank you, Gauro, for saying that. So I think I found all my problems. I was just being, oh, maybe not. I was just being silly. Okay. Nearly there. Perfect. Slowly getting there. So, oi oi oi. Really made a doozy of this now. See, by the way, that looked really weird for a second. All I did was I hit Control 0 on my keyboard. I've been doing this for years, so I haven't really thought about it. I hit Control 0 and it kind of like re-zoomed my page correctly, like setting it on 100% zoom. And then everything seems fine again. I know some of you have had problems with your browser. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Beautiful. So yeah, try like Control 0 or something. That could help. Okay, this is getting there now. It's kind of working what we want. Usually below a certain size, we're going to snap into something. And let's also try to see this out. Let's set the height to 100%. Okay, that kind of works. This area down here isn't really looking great, which isn't a good sign. The problem with height being 100% is it's a really complicated... what's wrong now? So grumpy. The problem is with height being 100%, it's a really complicated thing. Oh, our page is all crap now. That's okay. I don't want to take this example too far because we have other things to do. But the point I'm trying to make here is that... God damn it, see? It's all fine again. Crazy. I think it's all to do with the zoom, honestly. I think this is different. I think this is a different thing. There's like the browser zoom and then there's the DevTools zoom. The point is that you can see here how I'm kind of having a different behavior on mobile and a different behavior on desktop, depending on what the screen width is, to make this look more normal. Height is a challenging problem. I'm not going to go through that right now, but it's an interesting one. There's a ton of great answers on Google. Let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll dig into JavaScript. So 5-minute break, JavaScript for the rest of the lecture, and we can learn about how to manipulate these forms. Hey everyone, so let's get back into it. And let's actually start doing some of the more dynamic parts of this. So here it says, we should have a text area with a welcome message. On blur, if the field is empty, color the background red. So now we're going to start getting into that JavaScript stuff that was like done in the week 3 tutorial. So first thing is, let's put our JavaScript here at the end of the body. Script type equals text JavaScript. Just for readability, I'm probably going to write it like as if it's not indented, but in reality you wouldn't even have it in this file. But it's just easier to see everything at once. So first thing I want to do is, what the hell does on blur of a field element mean? Well, a form element. So text areas, inputs, these things where you can kind of focus on them. Like if I type text, nothing happens. If I click on this and I type text, something happens. So this is the focus on an element. So I'm not focused on the element, I am focused on the element, and when I click off it, it's what we call a blur. So I can listen to that event if I want to. So first thing I'm going to do is give my text area an ID, which is welcome message. And now I'm going to say document.getElementById welcome message dot add event listener. I'll listen for the blur, and then we'll trigger a particular function when there's a blur. So this is a fairly standard programming pattern, which is document.getElementById. You do it by the ID, and then you might get rid of this thing. Yep, you do it by the ID, and then you get some thing. Now blur here is not working, probably because I've made a mistake. Is it on blur? I don't know. JavaScript input blur. Oh, blur. Ah, okay. Maybe I've conflated these. Event listen blur. Blur event. You're gonna forget things all the time, and that's fine. And I think I forgot this, but apparently it seems okay. I'm not sure what the problem is. Need to add event. I don't need to add event. So I don't know what the hell happened before. Maybe I didn't see it or I didn't refresh it. So this is a callback, right? So I'll just cover this again. So this is a callback, which callbacks are talked about more next week, but basically it's a function. So I say here handle blur, it's a function, and the function is going to console log something. And then I pass that handle blur into the add event listener, because add event listener takes in the event to happen and the function to execute when the event happens. When it's called, though, we will often pass in the event parameter if you're interested in it, which we are in this case. Devansh says, is it fine if we just added on blur as an input attribute instead of adding an event listener? For the assignment, I think that's possibly fine. So you can do things like that. There are HTML on blur things which will actually execute JavaScript inside of here. Like you can do things like this where you're like, oh, I'll just execute this JavaScript. I think the thing is though, wow. The thing is though, that's generally frowned upon because it splits your code up into many different places. So I'd say that it's generally gonna be a bad idea. Probably the only exception where it's sometimes tolerable is if there's like really, really short pieces of JavaScript to do, which in this case there possibly aren't. So I would just be cautious of it because it can just reduce the readability of your code because stuff's spread out. So when the element blurs, I'm going to do something, and the spec here says color the background red. Okay, so I'm going to say I want to get the welcome message, and then I'm going to say dot style because I want to modify its CSS properties, dot background equals red. Yay, so when I click off it, the background's red. when I click off it, the background's red. Now, but that's not what it wants to do. It doesn't say on blur make the background red. It says on blur if the field is empty, as in if there's no text in here, we make it red. So I'm going to try and console log the text. Now, I think from memory, oh, it's inner HTML, I think. Actually, what is it? I don't do text area stuff very much. Okay, it is target value. So text areas are really weird because with an input, you tend to get the value of the input by doing like the event object.target.value. With text areas, though, I'm pretty sure you can also get the inner HTML or inner text. I'm not sure. Inner text, is it? Inner text? No, I think I'm crazy. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like that was maybe possible. Maybe I've done that wrong. But for all field inputs, that's kind of how you get it, because most field inputs are void tags. So I've got the value there. Now it's pretty simple. I could just store that in a variable and say like input text equals this. And then I could just say, you know what, if input text is blank, then I'd like to set it to be red. And you think, ah, done. Okay, not blank, now it's red. One of the problems here is that this is going to be really like, tell me a usability problem with this right now. We've kind of done some interesting JavaScript where we've said this is a function to call every time a blur happens, where we grab information about the event that's occurred, we get the value of the text input. If it's blank, we set this particular DOM element to have a background style of red. Okay, that makes sense, but like, what's the usability problem we have here? The thing about usability, just while you're answering that, is you don't really have to be a genius to think about usability, right? Like, there are certain elements, like if I had a designer, they'd tell me things about spacing and colors and why the blue and grays don't work. But it's like usability, there's things that you can figure out just because you're all internet users. You were born in the age of internet, right? Melanie says, not clear to user why it's red. Yeah, so that's one thing. We should make it clear to the user. I'll probably skip over that just for time, but that's definitely a thing that should be done, as in there should be some kind of informational text there. Quinjan says, becomes red and it doesn't turn white again. So that they're both right. I think the first one is probably more what I was going to fix because it's easier and more interesting, which is just so there's a couple ways we can do this. We can say, okay, well, if it's red and it's not red, it stays red, because the way this logic worked, right, is every time it blurs, it checks if it's blank and then it sets it to red. So there's nothing to ever trigger it to be set back to white. So we could obviously add an else statement here just to set it back to white. So I click off it, it's red, I type something and I click off it and it's white. Now, even that in itself poses some usability problems, because if they click off it and it's red and then they click back on it and they say hello, when you click off it again, it's white, but during the typing it was red, which makes it really hard to read. So what you might actually be more likely to do is to actually add another event listener on the focus, which is when you click on it, or you could even do this on click as well, but let's start with on focus, where we'll make another function called handle focus, and all handle focus will do is whenever someone clicks on it, no matter what happens, we will just set it to be white. So we'll try this one. Okay, it's white, type something in, everything's fine, we get rid of it, we click off, it's red, they go, oh, something's wrong, I click on it, and it's okay now. Now you could take this one step further by keeping it red until they type in it, but this is probably absolutely fine. But you can see here how it's actually not that hard if you know what to do. It's actually not that hard to create interesting dynamic behaviors on the web. Now, one thing I'm going to do here is start cleaning up my JavaScript. The first thing is, and you can use your basic programming principles for this, I'm using the same object 4 times. So I'm going to say const welcome message equals that element here. And then I'll just reuse that. So every time I see this here, I'll just reuse it like that. So that's one thing I can do. And then the next thing I can do is, usually with event listeners, we don't separate the add event listener binding and the actual handler. So we normally combine them together, a little bit like anonymous functions. So instead of saying that we're going to call the handle blur function, we actually just pass the function anonymously like this. And that's generally considered quite clean. Probably another easy thing here is that I think that's all fine. Yep. Whoop. Whoa, what have I done? Now when I click on it, it's red. Oh, I got the blur and focus mixed up. Funny. I also kind of don't need this extra variable extraction here. I could keep this very simple and just do that. Right, and now we have very, very simple code that does what we expect it to. Patrick says, is using a global variable in JavaScript a bad style? Pretty much everything in JavaScript is global, which is part of the problem with JavaScript. In fact, that's kind of what cross-site scripting is, in a nutshell. Which is a problem we face. Where if I again go back to CSESOC's website, I just look at the source code. You see that CSESOC will have some JavaScript here probably that they'll import. Maybe they wrote. Did they write any JavaScript on this page that they import? That's theirs. Yeah, say there's something here like this infinite scroll library. One of the whole problems with JavaScript, which is why it's like you got to be really careful when you code it, is that everything kind of has global access. So if I actually import a file like this onto the page, and this isn't going to do anything, I don't think. What happens now is that, oh, it won't let me access it. That makes sense. That's a shame. Why is that? Oh, 404. 404? It's okay. That might be better. Yeah, so one of the problems here is that if I was including this on my page, CSESOC could actually go along and modify this particular file, and all files imported actually have global kind of access. So they could literally come along and write some malicious code in that file that I'm importing, and it could really manipulate the page. It could like change the name of the variables or inject fields in. Browsers can be dangerous places. I think there's a web app security course that covers this in a lot more detail, so if you're interested. The second thing is it says has 2 inputs for email addresses with an add more button at the end that populates more fields. Okay, 2 at a time. So what we want to happen now is that when we click add more, we're going to add 2 more email addresses. Okay, that makes sense to me. Let's try and do that. So we got this add more button. I'm going to actually change this class name to an ID name called add more. And I might just change this from class to ID here so it actually works. Great, and now we're going to try and bind something to it. So I got my add more button, which is a document get element by ID, add more. Yes, I know I have inconsistent styling. That's fine. No, it's not. What have I done? God darn it. Okay, that's fine. So I got this add more button. Let's bind something to it. So let's say add more button dot add event listener. Let's say that we want to do something on the click. And on the click, we want to just say alert, go. Yep, we get that alert. Now remember, you don't need this event property if you're not using it. So see how we're using it in the blur? Because we actually want to know something to do with the event, which is the input text. Whereas on focus, we don't care, so we can just get deleted if we want to. Similar thing here, we don't care about something on click. So what we want to do here is we actually want to create more HTML elements. Now, this can be a little bit tricky because what we actually want to do is create another one of these email input boxes. So if you remember this from the tute, what we're going to end up doing here is creating another email input box and appending it after this element. Because of this, usually something you want to do is if you're ever like doing this thing with JavaScript where you're kind of making many of things and adding them and deleting them, usually you want to wrap that in its own component. So I might call this email input boxes. And I'll wrap that inside of its own component. Now that should work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my own component with JavaScript. I'm going to say const email input box equals what is it, document? I've already forgotten. Is it just create element? Is it document.create? Yeah, I'm not, sorry, I was going crazy. I was like, I feel like this is harder. Get to that question in a sec. Document.create element. So I would like to create a div element, right? And I would then like to email input box / add class, which again, I always forget the keywords of these functions, and you aren't expected to remember them. Email input box. A JavaScript add class DOM. I feel like I did this on Tuesday and I've already forgotten. How to add a class to a given element. Blah, blah, blah. I feel like there was a quicker way. Someone tell me. You're all geniuses. Maybe it's just add class. Class name. Class name, that's right. I think it was class name. Yep. Great. So now what we've done is we've basically created this div here, and I can show you this because what we'll do is I'll console log the actual email input box like this, and I'll show you as we build it. So as we build it, when I click this button, you can see that that's the div we have so far. So before we add that class name, it's just an empty div. But we add the class name, so now it's an empty div with that class name. Now we actually want to add our text and our field of inside of it. So we might create our text now. Const text equals document.create element, which is div, and text.class name equals text. Right? We also have some text inside of that, which we set, I think it's like inner text like this. So we set the text inside of that to say email address 3. And now let's print out these two elements. So when I click add more, you can see we've got our div, email input box, and then we've got our div class text. But we want to put one inside of it now. So we say email input box dot add child text. So I think it's add child, append node, I don't even remember. Add child. What is it? Add children, append children, pen child, pen child. So append child means add a child inside of it and append it to the end. So now when I click it, you see we have this div and this is inside of it. So if we repeat the exact same process here, whereby we create our field element, which is this one here, and we give it a class name of field, it has no inner text. So now we have our field, and we can append our field to our email input box as well. And now it looks like this. You guys are also the fact that like 30 or 60 seconds after I've done it, you all send me the same message at the same time tells me just how good you are, just how much you're all like, I know exactly what he should have done there. So now I have this, and I just need to add something inside a field. So I'll say const input text equals document.create element. This is a type input. I will set its and let's print this one out, right? So if I just print out input text, it's just this HTML element with basically no tag, no attribute. So I need to set input text dot set attribute to type is text, and I think that's the main thing. And then I just need to append that inside field. So I say field dot append pen child input text like this. Then I click add more, and now we have our HTML element and that we've created from scratch. And now what we're going to do is, after we're done with that, we will go and append it to document.getElementById email input boxes. append child email input box. So we're actually now going to put it in the DOM. Previously we were like creating a component that wasn't like quite in the like rendered yet, and we were just like building it, and now we're actually putting it in the page so it renders. So when I click add more, I get more of these fields, right? So we're dynamically updating this page. Something else you'll notice is that we're obviously repeating the number 3 here. So I can fix that just by using some kind of global counter. I'll say like let input counter equal 2, like this. And now what I can do is I could say, you know, the inner text is actually going to be input counter +1, and then I'll say input counter plus equals 1, like this. So now we get 3, 4, 5, 6. So the next thing is it says that we want to input these 2 at a time. Now if we input these 2 at a time, then one thing that's really handy to do is actually to break a lot of your complex DOM creation, if you break that up into separate functions. So I'm actually going to make a function here called create email input box. And all this function is going to do is actually create all of this stuff and return me the actual DOM element itself. So now I don't have to worry about this messy code. I just know that when I call this function, I get like a fresh DOM element, and I'll actually give it the counter here. So I'll actually give it the counter as like as a function argument, like that. Right, so now we have this, and what happens is when someone actually clicks on add event listener, I'm going to say const email input box equals create email input box. I will give it input counter +1, and then I will increment input counter, like that. Nice and separated. What happens if I want to insert 2 at once now? Well, that's even easier. I can just repeat this process twice, like that. I just copy and paste it, right? Simple functions. Oops. Yeah, sure. Like this. Now I'll add 2 at once. 2, 2, 2, 2. Oh, now we got some red there. That's not good. So Kevin says, is using add event listener preferable rather than creating a function and linking it to the onClick, onBlur, onFocus? Yes, it is. So what Kevin's talking about there is, should we do this, or can we say const button click equals this function, and then go and say button on click equals button click, right? That's Kevin's kind of question. I think that's generally not a good approach, because it's a little bit like inline styles. You're essentially mixing these different concepts together. Like, right, it's really handy having styles separated and having HTML separated, and in a similar way it's really handy having HTML separated and having JavaScript separated, right? Melina says email input boxes can give us number of children it has. Yeah, so email input boxes itself is a DOM element, and inside of that is no doubt going to be some kind of metadata associated with the number of children, which people in the chat have pointed out. There is actually one which is, what did you guys say it was? It was like .child element count. So it'll actually count the number of children it has. So let's try that one, and we'll have to play around with this a bit. Oh no, that's not what I want. Okay, so if I click add more, this seems to work now. Wow, that worked pretty seamlessly for us. So rather than using this input counter thing here, I instead just had child element count actually pass that in like this, and then just append it there. And in fact, I don't even need all this extra lines and stuff. I could just slap this right in there like that, and I could just repeat the line twice. Yeah, so I just like to do that twice. I would never bother wrapping that in a for loop. You might see, that's the thing, like you might always have this hesitation to be like, I'm a programmer, don't repeat myself, but it's like, this is a lot easier to read and a lot clearer what it does than a for loop, trying to loop once, like twice or whatever. What have I done? What's the problem? Child element count is not a function. Why is that? Oh, I don't know. I don't know why that's not working. Weird. Maybe something to do with order of definition. No, I've screwed it up. Okay. Child element count. Why was it working before? Was it working before? Am I going crazy? It was working before, wasn't it? It is an attribute. Oh, sure. Maybe it wasn't working before and I false positive. Let's just print it out and have a look at it. Oh, it's an attribute, not a function. Oh, I see. Okay. That makes sense. It's just a property of the object. It's not a method of it. Perfect. Okay. Now you can see here, once I get to 10 and above, we get this weird red line here. This is actually really simple. This is just because 10 doesn't fit on the line, so therefore it's expanding the size of the flex box, and the input has a fixed height, so the red is actually just like backfilling it, because I feel like I've left this property on there somewhere, like background red. Yeah, the field had a background of red. So we can get rid of the red background, but that doesn't really stop the spacing issues. So what we'll do here instead is we'll actually probably just increase the width of the text area. So rather than it being 135, we can just make it slightly wider, which will fit the text in. Like that. It still looks a bit weird there, so we'll give it a tiny bit more space, just so it can actually breathe. Okay, see, much more appropriate. Yeah, so that's correct. This is kind of how large front-end projects would work. Is people would actually kind of have these component nearly factories, if you will. Okay, so there was a question that Julius asked before, which is using the variable on which the add event listener method is called within a callback a good style? I used it as an alternative to this keyword. Can you give me an example of what you mean, Julius? I'd love to understand what you mean, just so I don't confuse myself. You probably couldn't make this code a ton cleaner, maybe a little bit, but generally, like, this is pretty fine. You can see here how I've tried really hard to separate out my kind of large definitions, my functions, and my event listeners as well. It also says that we should stop once we reach 10 addresses. Well, how are we going to stop once we reach 10 addresses? We can do a check in button click here. So I could actually say, you know what? If input box's child element is less than 10, then we'll do this, I guess. Okay, and you know what? Even better than that, maybe we can be even smarter than this. We can say, you know what? If the number of children is now greater or equal to 10, then I'm actually going to add more button dot style dot display equals none. I'm going to hide it. I'm going to like basically remove that button. Okay, so it's gone. That's another way to do it. Julia says, arrow functions I read have this global scope where you can't use this keyword on it, so I worked around it by using the actual DOM element in its own event listener, if that makes sense. Yes, I think I know what you mean. JavaScript event listener, this element. I haven't used a this like method when it comes to vanilla JavaScript. I've used it a lot with Jquery though. Just having a quick look at this. I mean, I assume what you're saying works, right? Like if you're just like this dot style dot whatever. Is this what you mean? Does this what works? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, does it not work with arrow functions? That's really interesting. Huh. There you go. I had no idea that was a thing. It's really interesting. I don't think it's particularly bad practice to do what we're doing here. If you want to use like the older style, just like function this and use this, then that's fine. What Julius is kind of talking about here is that if you don't use the new arrow syntax, then what actually happens is inside that function, it populates a variable called this, which is actually the subject here. So basically this is welcome message, because the event listener is being applied on a particular DOM object. So this will be that DOM object, and it's kind of how people avoid, having to write like this kind of thing, because a lot of the time, events that you bind to a particular DOM object will trigger changes in that DOM object itself, right? So, and that's happening here. Like button click is wait, where's the button click event listener? Oh, I put it up here. Right. Sorry. Bad. Not good. Button click. Sorry, I mean add more button dot add event listener. Click. Button click. And again, like you honestly could just take this and slap it inside. Cool. Now earlier someone asked me a question, which is what's the point of form attributes? So if you watch the forms lecture, I think Anna talks about, sometimes you'll have like form action and method like this. Basically, form tags are a little bit of an older school concept, where what used to happen was that you would make a form, and when you click on a button or a submit button inside the form, what would happen is it would take all of that data in the form, in all of the text areas, inputs, checkboxes, radio buttons, and everything else, and it would send it to this URL inside this action tag here. And you can actually see, like, this is what happens. If I https://google.com, this will actually cause your browser to take all of the form inputs here. When I click add more, which is just a button, by default it'll trigger this on any button or input of type submit, and it will take all that data, like Google, you suck, and it will send it to Google. So if I actually maybe load up the network tab and I click add more, you'll actually see that it tried to load google.com here, and see if I can see this data. Request headers. We don't want headers, we want the actual body. Preview, response. Nah, I can't remember where to find the body. I don't know, but basically, actually, yeah, I can show you another way. So method is get. Maybe Google will allow this. Let's have a look. If I click add more, nah, it's not liking it. So basically, that's the old style of forms, and like you probably know that because you think about your usage of the internet. Sometimes you click you type something in a form and you click a button and then it like reloads the page. That's basically just the page sending data in the form to the page you tell it to. So the way that the web has developed has been very much that rather than use all these really simple inbuilt approaches like that the browser provides, is actually to manipulate things directly. So rather than just kind of collect details in a form and sending them off to another URL, you actually collect them with JavaScript and then maybe make a quiet network request in the background. So everything's really complicated now. And because of that, you just don't really submit forms the same kind of way. So back to that original question, what's the difference between the inputs? Nothing in reality. It's just that without this form here, there is no capacity for a button to send all the form data to a particular page that I've asked it to. It's just a button. And if I didn't bind an event to it, you would just click it and it would do nothing. Okay, we got like 10 minutes, a bit under 10 minutes left. What other questions do people have about this example that we've been through today? Or JavaScript or anything of that sort? How do you make the body take the whole height? Well, I mean, the answer, how do you make the body take the whole height, is not too hard. We've done that here because we've set the background of the body. I think a harder question is how do you make something inside the body take up the whole height? And I think the answer to that's a little bit complicated. What I would it depends what you're trying to do. Like if you're trying to make something take up the whole height that doesn't have margins and borders and padding, then it's not too hard. But if you're trying to make something like this take up the whole height, it's a little bit harder. Sometimes you could honestly solve it with JavaScript by like manipulating the actual height of this element and looking at the viewport height. But again, I would hesitate to give you. It's hard to give very general advice on that because it's very use case specific. Xiao says, if I only got one style like font size for a particular div, is it better to structure it like a style sheet or write in line? It's pretty much universally always better to structure it like a style sheet. There's other reasons for that as well. Like it's not just the fact that it's cleaner. There's also the fact that whenever you load a web page, like CSESOC's web page, it actually caches a lot of the external things. So when you load CSESOC's page, it loads all this crap here, and some of them are CSS files. I don't know which ones would be. Screen.css. And this one here, you can see this one I think actually, yeah. See here how it says served from memory cache, and the time taken was 0 milliseconds. So what that means is that if CSESOC actually modified that CSS file right now, I wouldn't actually get the update from it until I like cleared my cache or did a hard refresh. And that's one of the reasons we like to externalize things too, because browsers will cache external files. So if you put stuff in an external file, you're actually often going to make the document smaller too. And I understand you're just talking about one style, so you know it's not going to make much of a difference, but that is a part of it, is it actually can speed up the loading quite a lot. But for a single style, in reality that might sometimes happen, but generally it's just not the best practice. Julia says, is a lot of what we've done still relevant for when we learn React? Yes, like yes and no. It really helps you understand what React's doing, and pretty much myself, people I work with at these tech companies who talk to about the course, tutors, pretty much everyone agrees that it's not helpful for people to learn React without understanding how it works. But there are, like, just in general, like your general JavaScript skills being developed are really useful too, because React, even though React doesn't manipulate the DOM in the same way, React still has a lot of the same principles to do with, say, string manipulation and functions and callbacks. So there's definitely a lot that's transferable. Lockie says, can we have this code later? Yeah, I'll push it to the repo after the lecture's repo. And she says, I saw people use current target instead of target. What's the difference? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, most of these things I don't really keep on the top of my head. Current target and target. Internet says events bubble by default, so target is the element that triggered the event. Current target is the element that the event is attached to. the event listener is attached to. Ah, sure. Okay. So, I mean, this one is pretty straightforward. For something like a button, it doesn't matter. But like what you'll sometimes have is this button will actually be wrapped inside of a div. Hello. Div ID equals hello. And inside of that div, this might have a, for instance, like a margin 20 pixels or something like this. And I might make the background red, just for demonstrative purposes. Background red. It's kind of ugly. Yep. So I'll have something like this. So what happens is that if I was to then create an event listener, right, document.element, get element by ID on hello, add event listener, click, then the difference here is that if I console log event.target and current target, then when I refresh this page and I click this, you'll see that current target is actually the down here. It's actually like the button that was clicked, like the actual element that was clicked. What is it? So current target's the element the event listener is attached to, and target's the element that triggered the event. Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. So because I've said hello at event listener, target will always be hello. Whereas current target's where I actually click. And remember that pages are built like layers. So you have body, and then on top of that is the container, and then on top of that is the hello, and on top of that is the button. So when I click here, I'm clicking on the div, which means that this event is not only binded to the div, but I clicked on the div, the hello. Whereas when I click on the button, it says, well, I'm binded to the hello, but you clicked on the button. Because remember, the div is here, and the button, like, if the div is here and the button lives on top of it. So it's essentially like current target is a lot more relevant if you are, you know, like I really don't use it much, but it's mainly just if wherever you're clicking is listened to by a different thing. So yeah. Devansh says, will we need to know jQuery? No jQuery. jQuery was a... jQuery was like a superset. It wasn't even transpiled. It was just a superset of JavaScript that... I'll show you an example, like jQuery example. So jQuery basically looked at this JavaScript code and said, let's write the same code, but not ugly. So with jQuery, for instance, you could, like, I'll show you an example, right? With jQuery, if I wanted to say, you know, what was that example I had just before? Yeah, if I wanted to say document.getElementById hello, this click thing, with jQuery, I would just literally write it like this: hello dot click event, like that. Same thing. It's like basically the same language, right? React's like a whole different thing. Angular, React, Vue, they're all wildly different. jQuery was basically JavaScript with pleasant syntax, which is why it got really popular, because it made writing stuff easier. And you know, you could do things with jQuery instead of saying, like, what did I do here before, where I said, like, let's hide something. Yeah, I said like add more button dot style dot display none. With jQuery, you could just say add more button dot hide, and all that dot hide function was literally an abstraction that just set the style dot display equal to none. So it wasn't a particularly it wasn't like a shattering change in understanding. You could take your JavaScript knowledge and just write things more elegantly. The problem is that JavaScript itself is a bit of a clunky language syntactically, but even more importantly, this style of programming, this, like, you know, Java-esque, this imperative style of event-driven programming, it did not work well for modern web apps. Because modern web apps are basically state machines. And I'm not going to get into it now because it's 7:57, but we'll talk about this more with React, and I think this was mentioned in Tom or whoever did it, can't remember, their lecture about it is like, with all this stuff, we have to keep track of events and re-rendering and all this stuff. And React just said, holy crap, web apps are all doing the same thing now. There are a whole bunch of actions that cause a whole bunch of updates to state of our programs. And then we need to re-render everything based on that. And they just said, let's devise a framework designed for what web apps are like. That whether it's jQuery or JavaScript just don't feel like a scalable approach to building these things. So that's why we talk about them later in the course. But you know, people are like, why do we learn these JavaScript things if we know React? It's like, you got to remember, you know, just as an example, like a large number of students go work at companies like Google and Facebook where they write these libraries. And it's like, someone actually has to write the tools, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, why do we use gedit or VS Code instead of, you know, some really nice editor to write things in? It's like, well, someone's got to build those nice tools you use online using more primitive tools. And also, if you actually go and work at like a lot of bigger tech companies, not a bigger tech companies, but certain products will use these more raw styles of JavaScript because they are faster, right? It's like C, right? C is a less of an abstraction than JavaScript. That's why it's generally going to be a faster thing to execute on. And it's a similar thing, like this will always outperform frameworks if written correctly because it's just raw. You're just like direct DOM manipulation. So, you know, it's not outright useless. It's very useful to at least understand and then sometimes to use. Anyway, I'm trying to finish lectures square on time, so that's all we have time for today. Thanks everyone. I'll see you next week. Good luck submitting your assignment, or for those who, or the bulk of you who are watching this after Friday night, I hope your assignment submission went well. And I'll see you all next week, where we'll, by then assignment 2 will have been released and all of that, so good fun. Anyway, have a great night. Enjoy your weekend. See you next week.